It was a warm summer night in Kentucky. At around 11:30 p.m., Russell Greenwell, the chief of police at Hopkinsville, was getting ready for bed when the phone rang. And he was wondering who could be calling at this late an hour. He picked up the phone, and it was one of his fellow officers calling. The officer told him, "Chief, we need you back down at the station. A spaceship landed in Kelly." The chief thought they were joking until he got at the station, and he found very terrified residents of Kelly. But what scared these people so bad? Well, let's rewind a few hours and set the scene. For this video, we're heading to the Sutton farmhouse in Kelly, Kentucky. It is Sunday, August 21st, 1955, in the evening. The farmhouse was full of people. This included 8 adults and 3 children. Glennie Langford, the head of the household, was joined by her 3 youngest children from her current marriage, Lonnie Langford, Charlton Langford, and Mary Langford. She also had her 2 oldest sons from a previous marriage in the home, Elmer Lucky Sutton and John Charlie J.C. Sutton. They were both joined by their wives, Vera Sutton and Eileen Sutton, respectively. O.P. Baker, Eileen's brother, was also present, along with another couple, Billy Ray Taylor and his wife, June Taylor. Really quick, before I start getting into the details, I just wanted to let you know that about 95% of what you're going to hear I found from one source called The Close Encounter at Kelly and Others of 1955 by Isabel Davis and Tad Blotcher. They're ufologists. They did extensive detailed work putting together an almost 200-page report, interviewing officers, the witnesses themselves, neighbors, and compiling a bunch of sketches and photos that you will be seeing throughout this video. At around 7 p.m. on that hot August night, Billy had gone out back to get himself some water from the well, when something stopped him dead in his tracks. He saw a flying saucer, which he described it as being silvery in color, bright, and giving off exhaust that had all the colors of the rainbow. And he apparently watched this flying saucer traveling a northeasterly direction over the house, stop midair, and lower itself into what he believed was the gully some 300 feet behind the house. If we look at a map of the farmhouse and the surrounding property, we can see lines and numbers in those lines. This is showing depth, not height. And we can see the gully where the saucer apparently landed, being about 30 feet deep. Now, Billy had run into the house and told everybody what he saw. And unfortunately for him, everybody dismissed him. They felt that he really only saw a shooting star. I also think it's important to note that Billy was one of those people that was interested in the alien stuff and knew about, say, the Flatwoods Monster incident, which had happened a few years earlier, and found interest in it. Did that play a role maybe in what he saw? I don't know. But with the next few hours and the events that are going to unfold, I'm sure they wish they believed him. While all this was going on, there was a neighbor that lived about a quarter mile from the Sutton farmhouse that said he saw lights coming from the fields near the Sutton farmhouse. And he just assumed that maybe somebody was out there with a flashlight or a torch or something trying to wrangle an escaped animal. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, nobody actually wanted to go and check the gully to see if an actual flying saucer landed there. It was only 300 feet, which wasn't that far from the property, but the problem was it started getting dark and nobody wanted to go searching in the darkness and maybe potentially even fall into the gully. About an hour after the flying saucer sighting, the family dog started barking out in the backyard. Elmer and Billy went out to investigate, and that's when the dog, being terrified, ran past them with its tail between its legs, hiding under the house. Billy and Elmer looked at each other in confusion and then looked out into the trees. And that's when they saw an eerie glow. This glow got closer and closer, up until they could finally make out a figure, what Elmer described as a little man. This little being, along with the others that will be spotted later in the night, were described as being 2.5 feet to 3.5 feet tall, humanoid in shape, with oversized round heads that were bald. No neck was seen. They had yellow glowing eyes. They had large pointed triangular ears that appeared leathery, clawed hands that were described as talons, and long thin legs that were described as like broomsticks. They had silver metal skin that shimmered in the moonlight, but apparently it got duller the closer they came to the lights that were present on the front and back doors of the home. This little being approached the men with its claws hands raised as if it was being robbed. So say Elmer and Billy. Now, these two gentlemen went back inside, and they returned to show this little guy some sweet American hospitality. When they had gone inside, Elmer grabbed his 20-gauge shotgun, while Billy had grabbed his .22 caliber rifle. And as this creature approached and was about 20 feet from them, they both opened fire. Now, this creature had apparently then done a flip and ran off into the woods. After this, the two men went back inside the house into the living room where everybody else was sitting. They wanted to make sure everybody was okay. And that's when one of the men spotted another one of the creatures hanging out by the window, peering inside. They took aim and fired. The creature apparently then did a flip and disappeared into the darkness yet again. Now, by this point, only Elmer and Billy had seen the beings, and for some reason, Mrs. Langford thought that they were just firing their guns for fun. Which, let me just stop for a minute here. You're talking about discharging a firearm in a room full of people out of a screen window, inside of a home. Like, I don't know how many of you have ever fired a firearm or been around one when it was discharged, but they're loud. There's a reason why people wear ear protection when they fire one. And you're talking about discharging one inside of a building. It doesn't make sense to assume that they're shooting for fun. I, in her situation, would have been concerned, like, hey, why the hell are you guys shooting in the house? But anyway, back to the story. Soon after, Aline had spotted one of the creatures, and this scared her so bad she suffered from severe anxiety for the next several days. Mrs. Langford was now more interested in seeing these beings for some reason, so she went out into the hall towards the front door with Billy, and they crouched and shut off the front porch light and waited. After a period of time, one of the beings started approaching the front door. The sight of this creature had startled Mrs. Langford, and she had fallen over. That and being in your 50s, which Mrs. Langford was at the time, and being crouched for a period of time probably isn't good for the joints. Anyway, when she fell over, she startled this creature, and it proceeded to start hopping, which is when Billy started shooting. This creature then jumped into the air, though they didn't see it come back down. Billy then proceeded to go out of the front door and stand by this little overhang roof bit that was right above the front door. And while he was looking out to see if he can find the creature, a small clawed hand reached down from the overhang roof towards his hair. Aline saw this, freaked out, grabbed him by the arm and started pulling him back into the house. Hearing all this commotion, Elmer was watching the back door, so he decided to then run to the front, push past everybody, out onto the front yard, look up at the roof, seeing this creature hanging out, took aim and fired, apparently sending the creature over the ridge of the roof. I'm surprised he didn't trip on his massive balls running past everybody. Then, from just inside the front door, Billy saw another one of the creatures hanging out on the maple tree straight in front of the house. Both men took aim and fired at this creature as it apparently floated from the tree branch onto the ground and then proceeded to run into the darkness. Then, before they could even get their bearings together, another creature came out of the darkness straight for Elmer. He took aim and, almost point-blank range, fired his shotgun, and he described hearing a sound of, say, a bullet ricocheting off of a metal bucket. The creature then did a flip, as always, and ran into the darkness. The two men had then realized that their shots seemed to be completely ineffective. So they went back inside with everybody and started to think about what they should do next. By this point, nobody really felt safe leaving the house, and they kind of just hung out watching the windows and doors, making sure these little guys weren't trying to break in any way. And the creatures seemed to dislike the light coming from the front and back of the house. And they always approached the house in the same way, the little clawed hands raised, slowly coming towards the house. Now, by this point, Mrs. Langford had also started to suspect that maybe these beings weren't a threat, and maybe they were just curious. Maybe they were just trying to communicate with the family. Maybe having their hands up and approaching like that is kind of a way of saying, hey, we come in peace. I was honestly impressed reading through the report at how calm Mrs. Langford was keeping the entire time, despite all the other women and children being terrified and the men being very concerned and on edge. Later on, they started hearing noises coming from the roof over the kitchen area. So both Elmer and Billy went out, looked up onto the roof, saw one of the beings hanging out there. So they proceeded to shoot at it. Apparently they knocked it off the roof, but then it silently floated about 40 feet over onto a metal fence, a little bit ways into the woods towards the back of the house, which then they started to shoot at it again. And at this point, the creature then proceeded to scurry off into the darkness where they couldn't see it anymore. Now, the witnesses had started to notice that every time these creatures were knocked off of a high place, like the roof or a tree branch, they always seemed to float and then scurry off into the darkness. And they also noticed that any time these creatures appeared to be running on all fours, it seemed like the front hands, the clawed hands, were doing all the work, whereas their back, thin, broomstick-like legs never seemed to really move or do anything. There was no indication of any bending or anything like that, as if they were just stiff and there, maybe just used for standing, and they can kind of walk like you had two peg legs, but not so much really for running. The witnesses also noticed that their shimmering bodies seemed to glow a little bit brighter whenever they were shot at, or whenever you would yell at them, as if somehow sound made them brighter. And with all the approaches that these little guys did, there was really no indication of aggression. And many of the witnesses inside the farmhouse started to think that maybe these guys were just curious little things that wanted to just approach and say hi. Granted, they're doing it in about the creepiest way imaginable. And as mentioned before, with all the women and children being scared, except for Mrs. Langford apparently, and the men being on edge, they decided that maybe staying inside the farmhouse won't be the best idea if these things do get aggressive. Sure, they had their firearms, but they were having no effect, and eventually they'd run out of ammo. So at around 11 p.m. that night, everybody decided we'll run out into the two cars, hop in, head down to the local police station, and get some help. As they all proceeded to exit the front of the farmhouse to the vehicles, one of the beings had popped out of the darkness and frightened one of the children so bad that he was just frozen in fear, couldn't move. He was just standing there staring at this thing, terrified. One of the men fired at the creature to scare it off, and somebody else then had to literally pick up the kid and toss him into the car. The witnesses flew down to the police station in Hopkinsville, which was just south of their farmhouse, and they entered the police station in such a frenzy of fear and panic that the police officers took them seriously. The officers then contacted some sheriff's deputies and state police, along with Chief Greenwell that I mentioned in the beginning, to meet up at the farmhouse and to do a little investigation. Now, when the chief showed up at the police station, before they headed up to the farmhouse, he had spoken to the witnesses, and he was inclined to believe what they were saying was true, just because of how scared they all appeared to be. The chief also described specifically the Sutton family members as being people who don't usually get law enforcement involved, and they have firearms and they're prepared to defend themselves, their land, their family members. They're more of a shoot first, ask questions kind of later people. And if they were down at the police station asking for help, begging for help, clearly something was seriously wrong. Some of the officers hopped in to their own vehicles, and some went into the vehicles of the witnesses as they traveled up to Kelly. Now, one of these officers was medically trained and took a good look at Billy while he was driving. Billy was very pale, and any time he described any of the events he experienced, he was very hysterical about it. And apparently he was so freaked out still that he could visibly see his heart rate on his carotid artery, just pumping along. And apparently this medically trained officer counted the beats per minute and saw that Billy had a heart rate of about 140 beats per minute, which was exceptionally high. And while you could probably fake being scared, it's kind of hard to fake everything to that degree. As the officers and the witnesses went back up to the Sutton farmhouse, about 2 to 3 miles north of Hopkinsville, by a restaurant called Shady Oaks, a state trooper was hanging out, and he reported to have seen a bunch of meteorites passing overhead. They were described as making loud, artillery-like and whining-like sounds. Were these meteorites related to the alien encounter? Or maybe perhaps it was just a coincidence. It's up to you to decide. I just felt like it was important to mention this. Anyway, the officers headed up to the farmhouse and were met by deputies and state troopers along the way. In total, at the scene, there were 4 Hopkinsville police officers, including the chief, 5 state troopers, 3 deputy sheriffs, and 4 military police. These military police had come from Fort Campbell, an army base that's just south of Hopkinsville. Some would confuse these personnel for Air Force, and there was a reason for that, which we'll get into a little bit later. Along with all these officers, a photographer from the Kentucky New Era newspaper named Harvey Reeder had caught wind of this excitement and had come to check it out and do a little investigation of his own for the newspaper. And for some reason, he also brought his wife. Because if you're going to go out and investigate potential aliens in the middle of the night, why not bring your wife? I mean, it was the 50s, so what did women really do? Sit at home, cook and clean, raise the children? I'm sure she had some free time that late. The law enforcement that were investigating the area had found several bullet holes through window screens, the screen door, in the ground, in trees, and so forth, along with shell casings in and around the house. Their investigations did not find any footprints or bodies or blood or really any kind of physical evidence that something was running around or anything alien was going on. Their searches through the home, the yard, and a little bit through the surrounding woods wasn't yielding anything. And they even tried to find any maybe logical reasons as to why these people are so freaked out. They couldn't find any evidence of, say, drinking or drugs. In fact, Mrs. Langford even said that alcohol was not allowed on the property. And several people who had interviewed Mrs. Langford, including Isabel Davis herself, had said that Mrs. Langford was the kind of person that was like a no-nonsense kind of person. She wouldn't be just making up some crazy alien story or going along with a crazy alien story if somebody else came up with it. While investigating, several of the officers felt a little uneasy, which is understandable. You don't know if there was some alien being in the woods just watching you. A funny thing ended up happening, actually. One of the officers had stepped on a cat's tail that just happened to be sleeping somewhere in around the farmhouse area where they were searching. This cat had let out a yelp, and it scared everybody because it was random and sudden so bad, and everyone just pulled out their guns and were on edge. I mean, I'm honestly surprised that cat wasn't lit up or somebody wasn't shot with so many people being on edge and armed. There was one noteworthy find. The chief, standing at the back of the house, was looking out towards the backwoods where the fencing was, and he saw a strange green glow down in the grass. And apparently one of the creatures had run off in this direction. So maybe they just found some alien blood that was just glowing. But when the chief went back there to look at the area along with some of his officers, they found that when they approached the spot, they couldn't see the glow anymore. And when they changed their angle of viewing, they then also, again, couldn't see the glow. Now, this was something that was very strange. None of the law enforcement cordoned off any of the areas of investigation to prevent any kind of evidence contamination or destruction. They also did not collect any physical evidence that was present, like, say, the shell casings from all the shootings. And nobody had a Geiger counter on hand to check for any elevated radiation spots that is usually accompanied with any kind of alien encounters or spaceship landings. Needless to say, the officers did not find any evidence of little spacemen or any spaceships. And by about 2 a.m., the law enforcement and photographer and his wife, let's not forget her, had left the farmhouse. And the officers that were leaving promised that once the sun rose, they would return to do a more thorough investigation in the daytime. The Suttons probably didn't feel any more safe, but the coast seemed to be clear, and they were willing to go back into their house and try to get some amount of sleep. They probably assumed everything was over and it was just a weird night. And that's when one of the creatures came out of the woods. At about 2:30 in the morning, Mrs. Langford, laying in her bed, looking towards one of the windows, saw one of the beings, with its little clawed hand resting on the screen. She called for the others to come in and see, and that's when Elmer drew his weapon to fire. Now, Mrs. Langford had told him not to fire, but he did it anyway, and so the cycle continued. There were more slow approaches by the creatures, and more shots being fired by Billy and Elmer. And this went on till about sunrise at 5 or so in the morning. Needless to say, nobody really got any sleep that night. And come early morning, Elmer, JC, and O.P. Baker ended up leaving for Evansville, Indiana to go do something involving a truck and some furniture. And then a little bit later on in the morning, Billy Ray went with a neighbor to go do some hunting. The women and children stayed at the farmhouse. In the morning, the police also returned to conduct a continued investigation. They re-examined the fields, the woods around the property, and the roof of the property. And once again, they found no evidence of any kind of bodies, blood, footprints, damage to the roof, or damage to anywhere else around the property minus the bullet holes. The police also checked the gully where the spaceship allegedly landed, and they did not find any kind of signs that a ship landed or any kind of burn marks or dead vegetation that's kind of associated with UFO landing sites. Now, there were some counterpoints to the lack of evidence. For example, the lack of footprints was attributed to the fact that the area had been suffering a drought and the ground was very dry and hard, and not even the policemen walking around were leaving footprints behind. And then when it came to the lack of damage to the roof of the house, where two of the creatures were at least spotted, the witnesses described really only kind of tapping and light scraping, so the police didn't expect to really find any damage to the roof. However, it was interesting that there was a layer of dust over the roof because of all the drought and dryness, but no disturbances in that dust was found. Also, the lack of bodies and blood was kind of expected since all the shooting did very little in any way to stop the creatures. The police had re-interviewed the women and children, with them giving the same details that they gave the night prior, and Chief Greenwell specifically was trying to trip up the witnesses by changing around some of the details from the previous night and telling them, like, oh, you said the beings were 5 feet tall, or they were this color, that kind of stuff. And each and every time he tried to trip up the witnesses, they would then proceed to correct him. Some of the neighbors were also interviewed, and, well, they didn't really see anything, and really some of them only heard some gunshots in the night. The houses weren't exactly right next to each other. There was some distance between each neighbor's house, so they they weren't really going to see anything. Because of the journalist photographer that had come in the previous night, by the morning this whole encounter had become essentially local news, and it started to draw in crowds towards the police station in Hopkinsville and at the farmhouse. Several news reporters and common people were trying to find out more details, and for a lot of people they were trying to see the scene itself at the farmhouse. One of these visitors was a man named Andrew Bud Ludwith. He had come from a local radio station to do an interview with the witnesses and to create sketches of what the witnesses saw. Now, he liked the fact that the people were all, or the adults specifically, were all separated come the morning for the most part. This way they couldn't all sit there and put together this one big story. This made it seem less like it was a hoax when he had gotten a sketch from each of them and then ended up comparing the sketches. And during his interviews to get these sketches, Andrew made it a point not to lead the witnesses, say certain things like, are you sure the ears look like that and maybe they were more like this? Or, you're saying that there was no texture to the skin, but maybe it was a little bumpy, kind of creating false memories in their heads and causing them to muddy up their descriptions. Apparently, others who had tried to get descriptions from the family members had kind of either created their own details or they had just led the witnesses and sort of made them unknowingly make up details. Throughout all his interviews, Andrew had kept an open mind. The first sketch we're going to look at comes from three of the women, Mrs. Langford and Elmer and JC's wives, respectively. From their description, we can see that they said it had a large bald head, glowing eyes, a pointed chin, the leathery triangular ears coming out of the sides, long arms, oversized hands with talon-like claws, and they did not see the feet. And as for a mouth, they really only described more of a line across the face, and they weren't really sure if something like this was an actual mouth. They also made a point to describe how the eyes kind of drew most of their attention, and they don't know if there were any other facial details that they may have missed. Then we have Billy Ray's description, which the most notable differences being that Billy claimed to have seen a nose, antenna, and suction feet. Billy seems to be the only one to have actually seen their feet, since nobody else, as you'll see in the next sketch, really got a look at their feet. Billy also described the body as more built, as if the little guys never missed chest day. He described the head similarly, and same with the ears and eyes, and the hands. It's also important to note that Billy was one of the guys that was shooting at these little things and probably got one of the better looks, along with Elmer, which in the next sketch, this was taken from Elmer, JC, and O.P. Baker's descriptions. From here we can see that the only few differences there are include the lack of a pointy chin, and the ears were described as being more back and not more out like the other two descriptions. I don't know how much JC and OP had seen the creatures, but Elmer certainly got a lot of really good looks. Now, these three gentlemen, when they were giving their description, they kind of refuted Billy's notion that it had a nose, which then Billy did take back his words saying that there was a nose. So as we can see with all three of the sketches side by side, these little beings were pretty well described by everybody in a very similar manner, with only a few discrepancies which, among eyewitnesses, is expected. The sketches that Andrew had created by the end of the day really shocked the witnesses, because all of them looking at these sketches just really showed what they saw. And all the witnesses would say that, if you ever wanted to know what these things look like, just have a look at the sketches. It did take Andrew some time, though, to get all these sketches. While the women were home all day, Billy didn't come back till later in the afternoon, and Elmer, JC, and OP didn't come back till later in the evening. And they were not happy when they came back. I'll get into that in a second. You see, as the day was going on, and with this becoming local news, and as I mentioned, a bunch of people were showing up to the farmhouse. Now, these people had absolutely zero respect for the property or the people living there. The farmhouse had essentially become like a tourist destination. It had people showing up, crowding the front and backyard, just trespassing all over, having a look around. They were looking into the windows, and they started entering the house without asking permission, without knocking. They just walked right in, trying to get interviews, trying to just get information out of the witnesses, telling them to pose for pictures, trying to get pictures with them. And even some people were trying to take some things to have as like souvenirs, which is really messed up. You even had some families just setting up picnics out on the front yard with their families, just hanging out. Like, who does that? I believe Andrew was really the only one who had permission to be on the property, and the family members and witnesses were okay with talking to, because he was just very respectful, very open-minded. A lot of these people that showed up to the Sutton farmhouse were heckling the witnesses. They were making jokes about the encounter, and they were making jokes about the witnesses themselves. And there were cars that were parked and lined up to the house in a half-mile from each direction on the roadway. And you had people that were also parked up on the front yard where the Suttons would normally leave their cars. So, remember how I mentioned Elmer wasn't happy? When he returned with the two other guys, they couldn't park anywhere near the house because of all these cars parked up by the crowds of people. Now, Mrs. Langford had told these people several times throughout the day to leave, not that any of them listened, and even when Elmer showed up, he was also telling these people to screw off. The witnesses, or Mrs. Langford specifically, had even contacted the state police, who had come multiple times to disperse the crowd. And every time the police left, the crowds kept coming back. And with the Sutton family members and the witnesses as a whole sleeping very little the night before and being up all day with all the excitement and crowds, they weren't really in the best mental state, and these crowds of people really had zero respect for their property or them themselves. I mean, I know these little creatures showed up and were peering through windows and hanging around outside, but at least they didn't go into the house, and aside from scaring the witnesses, they were more respectful in other ways. You even had some of these people that were crowding around the house trying to essentially set up souvenir stands and sell things like food and drink, or even souvenirs. And by souvenirs, I mean things that they basically took from the family members. I really felt bad for the witnesses. They had a whole terrifying night, and then come the next day, they're sleep deprived, and they're having all these strangers on their property, in their homes, making fun of them, dismissing their claims, really putting their mental states at a low point. I'm honestly surprised that Elmer specifically didn't start shooting at people for being in the house and being on the property. Kind of strange they were willing to shoot these little creatures that seemed more curious than anything, but all these actual hecklers and annoying people, they weren't willing to threaten with their firearms. Keep in mind, all this craziness with the crowds and the people and the heckling, all of that stuff happened literally the day after the witnesses had their terrifying encounter. And needless to say, unless there was constant police presence, these crowds weren't really going to go away, and they were going to keep bothering the witnesses and keep loitering about on the property. And this problem persisted for several days. Mrs. Langford had even put up a no trespassing sign. Not that it stopped anybody. So then she decided, what if I charged people 50 cents to be on the property, $1 for an interview or any kind of information, and $10 for a photo, which was a lot at the time, given it was the 1950s in rural Kentucky. And, well, again, it didn't stop the crowds. Nobody was paying anything. There was no way to really enforce any of this. And again, I don't understand why they didn't just use their firearms and threaten people to get off their property. I'm sure the police would have been cool with that kind of threatening. Charging people did have a drawback. Some of the people that were sympathetic towards the Suttons and their terrifying encounter and were kind of leaning towards believing them started not believing them once they found out that they were charging people to be on the property. They saw it more as a hoax then, and after they got their popularity and notoriety, now they're trying to profit off of it, which in no way is that true based on all the stuff I've read interview-wise with Mrs. Langford and some of the other family members. They hated the attention. They didn't want the people there. They wish they never even spoke up about it. Mrs. Langford specifically, in one of her news interviews, was begging people to just stay away from the house. With all the harassment and rumors about the family going about because of this incident, they decided, let's pack up and go to Michigan, where they had relatives they could stay with for a few days or weeks to let everything blow over. But halfway through their journey, they realized, well, we can't just leave the house undefended, and I don't mean from the aliens, I mean from the crowds of people who would notice that the house was empty, enter anyway, and then just start stealing everything that wasn't bolted down as a souvenir. The house didn't have any actual locks for the front or back door. Fun fact for you. Not that the locks probably would have stopped the crowds from busting in. I should note that around this craziness, at some point, more military personnel from Fort Campbell came, and they had asked for as accurate a description the family members could give. And with that, they then later came back with like a little model, and Mrs. Langford felt that the model was very accurate to what they saw. I do have a photo of a model from the report. I don't know if this is the model that the military had made. I doubt it, just because all this stuff ain't right, including the feet, but it's still a cool little piece to include. Speaking of military personnel, the U.S. Air Force also had caught wind of this incident and went and investigated it as part of their Project Blue Book, a little project the Air Force had going between, I believe, the 1950s and the late 1960s to investigate UFO sightings and alien encounters. They had a very brief little report, summary written about this whole incident, and they chalked it up to just misidentification, but they didn't think it was a hoax. They believe that the Suttons actually saw something, they just don't think they saw anything alien. And I do plan on doing a video on Project Blue Book at some point in the future. First, let's talk about the spaceship that Billy saw. It's largely believed that this was probably a meteorite that was passing overhead, and that as it was getting towards the tree line, in the dimming light of the day ending, maybe it appeared to have just stopped midair and then dropped down, when in reality it was just getting further and further away. The Perseid meteors were active at this time, I believe starting around July and ending around early September, peaking mid-August. You would have these meteor showers that pass through the area, and there would be all kinds of colors in these meteor showers, and a lot of them would be very bright. Around the time when the sighting happened was a little bit past the peak. I believe the peak is somewhere around August 11th to 12th, maybe in the 13th. And with all this going on around the 21st, we've passed the peak, but it's still entirely possible that these meteors could be passing through, and that's what Billy saw, including what other witnesses saw at that time, whether it was neighbors beforehand or that state trooper that saw something later on in the night. And you have to remember, there was no evidence found of any kind of UFO landing. And from other UFO cases that I've read, usually there's some kind of scorching or tree burning or signs of radiation affecting the area. Granted, nobody checked for elevated radiation levels. What about the little men, these supposed aliens? Well, one theory proposes that maybe the witnesses just saw great horned owls. I mean, the appearance can be very similar, with their horns looking kind of like the ears that were described. Great horned owls also have a yellow eye shine when light reflects off of their eyes. Their eyes are designed to absorb as much light, them being nocturnal creatures. The height of great horned owls is also very similar to what was described by witnesses. Great horned owls generally being over 2 feet tall, with the little men being described as anywhere between 2.5 to 3.5 feet in height. These owls are silent flyers, so maybe that can explain the several times when the witnesses saw them floating. I mean, from an evolutionary standpoint, they're perfect predators for the nighttime. Though one thing that doesn't really add up from what witnesses described was shining in the moonlight. These owls don't shine. They're pretty good at blending in the darkness. The idea of them being not too fond of the light kind of makes sense as well. You got to think about it. At nighttime, owls can see pretty well, and when you have any kind of light source, it's kind of very blinding, so they would kind of stay away from those. Owls can also tread on the ground with their little taloned feet, though I'm unsure as to what may have confused witnesses to the type of legs that were described that the little men had, those thin broomstick-like legs. So that's something I can't figure out. Great horned owls can also be very protective of their territories and nesting sites. Now, with the time period being August, it's not generally the time when great horned owls will do their nesting. It's usually between February and March. But they'll still protect their territories. And generally, great horned owls will stay with their mates throughout the year. And the witnesses describing one or two potential aliens could be explained by just two owls constantly flying around. Now, the aliens that were described weren't really showing any outward aggression. Great horned owls have done things like swipe at people with their claws. So that part doesn't fully add up. And also you got to think about these things were shot at multiple times. And I don't know how aggressively great horned owls will defend their territories, but I feel like after a lot of loud banging and bright lights, maybe they'd back off. And maybe that's what they did when all the police and everybody showed up. But with all the, especially point-blank fire, were all the shots really missing? And one little tidbit of information that I found, not that I could confirm it, but somewhere in all my research stuff, somebody had said that there was a nesting pair of great horned owls somewhere in the area, and this little attack might have been them flying through the area. And if you remember, some of the shots that were fired were described as sounding like they hit a metal bucket, or some kind of metal clanging. There was a metal fence towards the back of the property, and I think some metal fencing around the front area. Some of the shots may have been striking that metal, and that's what could have been causing the sound, because it sure as hell wouldn't have been owls getting shot making that sound. Certainly wasn't any kind of armor-clad owls flying about. You also have to think about how reliable were the witnesses in the mental state they were in as the night progressed, and in terms of the poor lighting. They only had a light on the front and back of the house, so that's not really going to illuminate much, being a little light bulb from the 1950s. And in terms of moonlighting, the moon was just recently at a new moon phase and was at a lower waxing crescent phase and wasn't providing much light. So it would be very difficult to see and differentiate different details. To me, it's possible that they could have seen owls. Not that it really fully adds up to everything that they saw and witnessed. You also had that green glow that the police had seen in the distance in some grass beyond a fence. Apparently, the way it was described to one researcher, felt that maybe foxfire was responsible for the glow, which is a type of bioluminescent fungus. Then you had some people say that maybe the witnesses were all hallucinating, but there's been no real evidence of that. Like I've said before, no alcohol was found to be involved, no drugs. I doubt there was any kind of gas leak or something like that that was causing them to hallucinate these things. I mean, you're talking about just about I believe everybody except for one person had seen the little men and described them all about the same. So it's kind of hard to have everybody hallucinate the same exact thing. And what about maybe mass hysteria? I also don't think this was necessarily the case. I don't think enough happened in the period of time, and the way the witnesses describe seeing these things, it doesn't seem like it was mass hysteria. Two people first saw it, and then, it pops up out a window and other people see it. It's not like people are just freaking out and shooting at rustling leaves or anything like that. I have a little bit of bonus information right here at the end. The term little green men was actually popularized by this story. Not that the little men were green, they were silver. And I also found a bunch of different misinformation, or at least poorly documented details while I was doing my research. Like I said before, the report I found about the encounter by those two UFOologists was immensely helpful. I found one newspaper article that was like 12 to 15 aliens were reported attacking these people, when in reality it may have been 2 or 3 that the witnesses really saw. And you're talking about a detail that was literally printed the very next day after this encounter happened. I get you got to sell newspapers, but did you really have to embellish that much? Oh, and a fun little thing I forgot to mention in the theories part. Somebody somewhere threw out this theory that maybe escaped circus monkeys dressed in circus attire that was silvery were to blame for this whole encounter. Now, Mrs. Langford, when she first saw these little beings, she did say it looked like a little monkey. No tails were ever reported, and the whole big ears and clawed hands doesn't really add up to monkeys. Nor could I find any information about escaped circus monkeys in the area at the time when everything was going on. You also had a couple of the people that were in the house that were witnesses to this worked for a carnival, like Elmer, for example. So I'm sure they'd be able to tell carnival monkey from strange-looking little creature. Then again, these were country folk, and some say that they mistook these creatures for great-horned owls, and you'd think that country folk would know what an owl looks like. I don't know. And that brings us to the end. Would really like to know what you thought of the whole encounter, if you have any of your own theories. Me personally, I think the Suttons weren't lying about anything. I think they generally saw something that scared the crap out of them. I'm not too sure if it was aliens. I feel like enough evidence points to more logical conclusions, but then you have some of the other stuff that you can't explain. Like, owls can't really do flips, so what was the whole flipping business? It would have been really cool if something like this was recorded and it could be properly analyzed. If you enjoyed the video, a like would be greatly appreciated. Subscribe if you want to see more. I will be covering a lot more. And until next time, if you see a shining light in the sky and it looks like it landed in your backyard, maybe close the blinds and try to get some sleep. Ignore all the sounds going on outside.